The reason I know this is most certainly going to be a Game of Thrones game from Software, it's because Bethesda not so long ago was approached with the same offer and declined it. What is up, guys? Ames Games here. Today we're going to be talking about a leak and other solid information that has From Software releasing a Game of Thrones open world RPG game, which sounds freaking amazing. So the first and most relevant piece of information we have is an article written, and the article is headlined this: I've consulted on a video game out of Japan, and that was a quote from George R.R. Martin. What badass video game company works out of Japan? Now I'm going to have the article linked down in the description below if you want to read it yourself, but it says this as follows. Back in March, YouTube channel Spawnwave published a video discussing a rumor regarding the next project from Dark Souls and Bloodborne developer From Software, which stated it is an open world title on which George R.R. Martin is one of the lead writers. Now here's a really important part, a part of the gameplay, which is with various kingdoms to visit and abilities to obtain from killing the leaders of those kingdoms. So that right there is an awesome indication of how we'll get our abilities, how we'll progress through the game. It sounds like we're basically going to be overthrowing probably evil rulers and kings. Now the article goes on to say this: a person familiar with ongoings at From Software has told Gamatsu that the project, said to be known internally as GR, Gamatsu has asked to only share the acronym, and in development for the past 3 years is an open world title with horse riding and collaboration between Hidaka Miyazaki and George R.R. Martin, published by Bandai Namco, which will be officially announced at Microsoft's E3 2019 press conference. While we have not been able to verify this information through additional sources, we have decided to share what we have heard in light of R.R. Martin's blog post. Now, the blog post does have some information they didn't put in here, and let me read the blog post real quick to you guys, and then we'll break that down and go over why this blog post is so important, other than just that one sentence that says he's making a video game out of Japan. Now the blog post is pretty long, not going to read the whole thing to you, but I will leave a link to it down in the description if you want to read the whole thing. Now it goes on to say this: as a producer, I've got 5 shows in development. 5 shows. Some have nothing to do whatsoever with the world of Westeros. So that definitely means that some of them are. For you Game of Thrones fans out there, I know Game of Thrones is my all-time favorite TV show, even with how it ended. Not going to do any spoilers if you're just getting into it. Now 2 at Hulu, 1 on the History Channel. I'm involved with a number of feature projects, some based upon my own stories and books, some on material created by others. There are these short films I'm hoping to make adaptations of classic stories by one of the most brilliant, quirky, and original writers our genre has ever produced. And I've consulted on a video game out of Japan. And then there's Meow Wolf. I don't know if the Meow Wolf thing has anything to do with whatever, but yeah. So we can tell that most likely most of his projects are based on Game of Thrones, or the majority of the projects are based off of Game of Thrones, which doesn't lead to the confirmation of the From Software game being a Game of Thrones title, but I think that is some very accurate speculation that we're doing, that it's probably going to be a Game of Thrones title. The lore is there, the world is already there, so that would give them a lot more time to focus on the core mechanics of the game, because there's a lot of new stuff that's being implemented that, you know, From Software games don't do. Like they don't have open worlds. They're open world, but you have to go in a certain direction. It's not an open world like Skyrim or Dragon's Dogma or Dragon Age even. So transitioning to that for a video game company, I feel like would take a lot of skill, and they're adding horseback riding, which is completely different. So we really got to think about the aspects of this game that are going to be completely different from past From Software games. And yes, maybe I'm leaving some stuff out because the only titles that I really know of and play from Software would be the Dark Souls series, and I've looked into the Demon Souls series, but never got into it. And again, this might not be a Game of Thrones video game, but here's why I'm convinced. I believe last E3, the time frame may have been different, not 100% sure, but Bethesda was approached to make an open world RPG based off of Game of Thrones, which Bethesda declined. Now think about it, what makes sense? Game of Thrones just ended. They had their last episode. It's gonna be a while before fans get to see another show start, or George R.R. Martin releases the new books. So what other pieces of entertainment could satisfy the fandom of Game of Thrones? And not only that, when would you want to release it or announce it? Only a few weeks after the end of the show, which E3 is happening on, which is going to be the Microsoft E3 press conference. That's when they are announcing it. Out of any time ever, this would literally be the best possible time for them to hype a game and get fans excited. Because guess what? Even though, like me personally, all my friends, everyone I know, anyone I talk to is very disappointed in how the ending came to be, but if another episode released tomorrow, everyone would watch it. So the hype level for this potential video game is at its maximum peak, its all-time high. So I really do think that we are going to be getting an announced From Software Bandai Namco open world Game of Thrones video game announced at this year's Microsoft E3 press conference, and I am so pumped for that. Now, some other information is that the Game of Thrones franchise, they've tried doing this before. They've tried making a Game of Thrones video game before. The problem was the games were developed by smaller, not very reputable companies. And we also have to take into account that years ago it was confirmed that Bethesda was approached by the Game of Thrones franchise to make a game based on their lore and their history. Now, where that would have been really cool and awesome, Bethesda declined. Now, the reason they did that is because they would have felt limited. They want to focus on their games, their franchises. It would have been a lot more beneficial for Bethesda to just decide to release another Elder Scrolls game instead. And to be honest, if it's not a Game of Thrones game, what else is it gonna be? They finished the Dark Souls franchise. We're never gonna have another Dark Souls game ever, maybe remasters in the future. The other possibility is for them to remaster maybe Demon Souls. Now, when they do announce this mystery title, fingers crossed that it is a Game of Thrones game, based on the timeline that Sekiro was announced and released, which it was announced at last year's E3, so this game is probably going to be announced at this year's E3 and released most likely a year after. Or close to, maybe a little more, a little less. Now, the last thing I have for you guys is, why is George R.R. Martin on the project? Now, it's obvious if it is a Game of Thrones game. If it's not, I think that simply means that Bandai Namco wants to focus more on the story. And actually, Mr. Maddie made a video recently. If you don't know who that is, look up Mr. Maddie Plays. He made a very similar video to the one I'm making today, summarizing a lot of the same things. But anyways, the point is, I really do believe if it's not a Game of Thrones game, that at least they're gonna focus more on the story. Now, Dark Souls fans, don't hate me for this, but like more narrative. And that's exactly what Mr. Maddie says in his video. Now, there's a lot of rich, juicy lore in the Dark Souls universe, don't get me wrong, but I'm talking about it being narratively presented versus just having to dig through it. I think people that are into Dark Souls lore probably won't like this as much, because I feel like if you are that into the Dark Souls lore, you're one of two people. You're like me, and I watch YouTube videos, so, you know, I get spoon-fed the lore. But if you're like other Dark Souls fans, I feel like the majority of the fandom enjoys digging through stuff, making the connections and stuff like that. But I think it would be really smart and behoove From Software and Bandai Namco if they went with more of a narrative version in the way they deliver their lore and the story throughout the game. And real quick, I think I've been slaughtering Namco Bandai's thing. Well, fuck, I think I just slaughtered it again. It's properly pronounced Bandai Namco. So now you guys don't really have an excuse to slaughter me down in the comment sections. I acknowledge it. I get it. I done messed up. But anyways, I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, smash that like button, subscribe for more awesome content. I want to be doing a lot more E3 speculation videos and E3 leaks up until about the 30th of this month. Come that time, I have a bunch of videos ready to be published if you're from the channel, because I'm going to be gone for 2 weeks, so I'm going to miss E3. But anyways, make sure you smash that like button, subscribe, especially if you want to see more E3 news and speculation videos, and I will see you on the next one. Bye!